Welcome to the next event by the James G. Martin Center for Academic Renewal. Welcome to everyone who's here in our webinar, and welcome to everyone who's tuning in on Facebook. Thank you for attending our event today, Free Speech and Liberal Education, a plea for intellectual diversity and tolerance. We're very excited to have Professor Donald Downs as our speaker today. I'm Jenna Robinson, president of the James G. Martin Center for Academic Renewal. The Martin Center is a nonprofit organization dedicated to higher education reform. We advocate responsible governance, viewpoint diversity, academic quality, cost-effective education solutions, and innovative market-based reform. As I said, today's speaker is Donald Downs, the Alexander Meiklejohn Professor of Political Science Emeritus and Affiliate Professor of Law and Journalism Emeritus at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He's going to discuss his new book, Free Speech and Liberal Education, a plea for intellectual diversity and tolerance. His work is especially timely and relevant given the current political climate and is always relevant on today's campuses where we never know whether free speech and intellectual diversity will be given their due. Dr. Downs is lead faculty advisor to the Free Speech and Open Inquiry Project of the Institute for Humane Studies in Washington, D.C. He has won numerous local and national awards for scholarship, teaching, and activism in support of free speech and academic freedom. His scholarship has dealt with a wide range of issues, including academic freedom and free speech, American politics, political and legal thought and movements, citizenship, campus politics, domestic violence, psychiatry, and the criminal law, and the relationship among the military, the university, and civic education. His most recent books are Restoring Free Speech and Liberty on Campus in 2005, Arms in the University, Military Presence in the Civic Education of Non-Military Students in 2012, which he co-authored, and The Value and Limits of Academic Speech, Philosophical, Political, and Legal Perspectives, which he co-edited in 2018. To our viewers, if you have any questions, you can add them at any time to the Q&A box down below, and I'll make sure to relay them to Dr. Downs at the end of this talk. And those of you who are watching on Facebook, if you have questions, please put them in the comments section and we'll get to those as well. Now I'll hand it over to Dr. Downs. Welcome.
Thank you, Jenna. My pleasure to be present today. I want to say hi to George Leaf at the center, and also thank Ashley Campbell for her help in this, as well as you. So welcome everyone. I also want to welcome the audience. I'm not sure where you're viewing from. It's a beautiful winter white snow day here in Wisconsin. So also welcome to the frozen tundra. I hope you watch the Packers this weekend in their playoff game. Usually I start by people ask me why I wrote the book. And I've been involved, as Jenna mentioned, in campus politics involving free speech and academic freedom for over 30 years. And it's also been a part of my research. So I'm in sort of an unusual position of having done a lot of research in this area, as well as having been very active in this area. And when I say active, I mean that the group I was involved with here at Wisconsin, which I'll be talking about shortly, I was involved in both policy making, policy reform here, and we also had outside counsel, and we had over 20 cases of individuals over a period of 20 years when we were in existence, 1996 through 2016, whom we provided legal defense to, whose rights had been violated or jeopardized. And we found satisfactory resolutions to each one of those cases. So I sort of brought this diverse experience in this area to the book. Also, I've witnessed over time the different cycles of campus citizenship. I mean, both in history, both over in historical time, because there have been ebb and flows here. Most of the previous censorship came from the right and was applied to the left, such as in the McCarthy era. And the new kinds of censorship that started in the late 1980s and early 1990s, which I call in the book the speech code movement, which is a different kind of censorship, mainly involving censorship coming from sort of the social justice or progressive left against considered conservative ideas and ideas deemed detrimental to social justice. And and more broadly, just to make it more comfortable for all students on campus, which of course is a good ideal, which we always strive to do in our teaching if we're people of good faith. So that was the broader, then I started seeing all these problems, starting with the speech codes. And then in recent times, a whole different set of policies that were not like speech codes, but were just as detrimental, if not more so, that I'll be talking about. The more specific or proximate cause was I retired, as Jenna mentioned, in 2016. And retired partly to Florida. We were down there 7 months a year, then 5 months back here in Wisconsin. We're no longer in Florida, for what that's worth. And all of a sudden, we started seeing pretty incredible speech disruptions taking place on America's campuses. And probably the speech disruption heard around the academic world was at Middlebury, which I'm sure many of the viewers know about. Charles Murray was shot down. The professor who moderated the event was physically assaulted, got a concussion, went to the hospital. And there was an extraordinary Middlebury faculty meeting afterwards where there was still support for what happened. It's really quite an incident. And there are other incidents like it. And these are what I would call more on the surface events, very apparent problems that only are very visible. And so that made me start to think, maybe I need to write another book about this. And also sort of talk about why free speech and academic freedom really matter in higher education, and sort of make it my final statement in my career about the nature of the problem, what to do about it, and why it matters. A lot of books about this don't really get at that normative question, why this matters. And in my estimation, an experience that matters, A, to higher education, without question, and B, it matters to the democratic republic, it matters to our country. Because we've seen the cancel culture that started at universities has now gone nationwide and is even working its way down into primary and secondary education. So a member of Cato, John Samples, a leader at Cato Institute, had contacted me over a year before and wanted to know if I wanted to write something for Cato. And I said, sure, but I didn't really know what. And then this stuff happened. And so I contacted John over a year after he contacted me, and I said, why don't I try to do a book about this kind of stuff and why it matters? And after a while, we decided to do it, and it led to the book. 2.5 years or so in the writing. So that's why I wrote the book. And then also I noticed all these new policies coming about. Wasn't just the speech disruptions. And by the way, the speech disruptions now have tended to wane. They go in ebbs and flows. So some people have even argued that there's less of a problem now in higher education because there are fewer speech disruptions. But that's too simplistic of a view. We have to look deeper for other kinds of problems that are there and that might be there. And sure enough, starting around 2010, we started seeing a whole host of new policies, bureaucratic policies on campus, many of which were accompanied by growths in campus bureaucracies. It's a big issue. The growth in the campus bureaucracy has been much greater than the growth in the number of faculty members. So universities are much more regulated than before. And regulation is often stifling of freedom. And the regulation comes from outside. It also comes from inside the university. So it comes from different directions. And we started seeing other kinds of events like non-invitations of people, things that are less easy to record and to get a record of. Policies covering so-called microaggressions, policies covering trigger warnings. I'm sure the readers or the viewers know a lot about those different things. Bias reporting systems, movement toward safe spaces in higher education. All this stuff started picking up in rapid speed as the second decade of the 21st century, I'm getting older, went on. I'll give you some examples. Trigger warnings warn students about dangerous or harmful information coming up. And they've been applied to things like, The Great Gatsby, to Ovid's Metamorphoses, to great literature And even more, Mark Twain, um, Homer, and in some cases to outright cancellations. I just read a report in the national press about Homer being canceled in high schools because of his insensitive writing. So trigger warnings are an issue. Microaggressions are lists of things that you shouldn't say to somebody because it might disturb them too much. And we always try to be polite. The problem is when these things are misapplied. And they can be easily misapplied because of the examples that universities use regarding them. So even using the term America in the University of California system was considered a microaggression. Saying to someone, work hard and you'll succeed, that was considered a microaggression. Flying the American flag, asking someone where they're from, calling America a land of opportunity. These are all considered microaggressions. And so one has to ask oneself, if all these kinds of phrases and others are microaggressions, how free can anyone feel to express an honest idea or opinion on campus? And one of the themes in the book, it's a huge theme, is that free speech and intellectual freedom are not just for research, they're not just for classes, they're also for all the dialogue that campus citizens have throughout the day and even into the night. What goes on in the dorm? What goes on down at the local bars? What goes on just in the nooks and crannies of campus? A really good university is alive with discourse. And clearly microaggression policy can suffocate that. Safe spaces, we've heard a lot about that. The University of Michigan Law School, in the wake of Donald Trump's election, had a special room set aside for law students at one of the greatest universities and law schools in the country could go and squeeze teddy bears for their safe space. We all know about the New York Times and the comment that when Tom Cotton published his op-ed a few months ago, and these are adult journalists at what is considered by many to be America's paper of record, claiming that the mere publication of that essay constituted a threat that made them feel unsafe. And I'll talk a little about the cultural aspects of that. The idea of words making people unsafe, except in the limited circumstances in which we've always considered that to be the case, like in terms of a threat. The expansion of the notion of threat, the expansion of the notion of harm, has eviscerated the distinction between speech and action, which is a very important aspect of First Amendment doctrine. And it's something I talk about extensively in my book. And finally, there are bias reporting systems, which encourage people to engage in anonymous complaints on campus. And Foundation for Individual Rights and Education has a list of these. They've been growing in recent years, spreading. We have one at Madison. And it allows anyone to file a complaint that go back to the bias reporting team, and then they can either just leave it there, make a report, or call somebody in. A new magazine started by, I think it was Steve Hayes and Jonah Goldberg, called Dispatch, did a study of UW-Madison's bias reporting complaints. They found 107 of them. One of them was because a professor used the phrase sacred cow. He said every country has certain beliefs that it considers sacred cows, a term that we've been using for decades to describe some sort of belief that no one wants challenged. And a student wrote a complaint that said that this professor, by using that term, that professor was racist, an acolyte of white privilege, simply for using that term. And I'm not sure if the professor was called in or not. I wrote an op-ed in the local paper about that, and other professors contacted me and told me that they had been brought in to talk about some of those complaints. So you get the idea. So these are a new kind of censorship that I think has to be considered. Now, before I get into some of the issues again, I want to mention a distinctive feature of my book, and I have alluded to it already, is that there's so many different aspects in it. It has an empirical component. It has a strategic component, meaning that I provide advice and examples of how to restore free speech on campus, or to at least make it more competitive than it has been. It has a historical component where I talk about the history of academic freedom, history of free speech. And it has normative and philosophical components dealing with the benefits, why free speech matters, especially to higher education, as well as the legal aspect. I talk a lot about the First Amendment. And I make a case, I don't just say this is the right thing to do because the Supreme Court said so, because the law says so. I make the claim that this is the right thing to do because of the consequences that flow from it, because it makes sense to do it. And therefore there's a match between what we should do and what the law says. And this makes sense because the Supreme Court's been working on this for decades and decades, and they had a lot of mistakes in the past. They had a lot of trial and error, and they finally got First Amendment down pretty well to a meaningful and set of principles and doctrines that do support free speech. Now, there's a host of cultural aspects to this. These policies didn't come from nowhere. Some of these are from the culture itself, not just the university. The era where institutions were more insulated from public opinion and the culture, I think, has passed us by, which is an interesting issue because it sort of shows that the classic distinction that helps sustain liberal democracy between privacy and the public realm has been weakened. And without that kind of privacy, it's hard to think that liberal democracy can sustain itself. Also, there's been a movement toward the therapeutics aspect of our society that Philip Reif wrote a book about called The Triumph of the Therapeutic. And sort of the idea of people being therapeutic subjects who are weaker than certain cultural assumptions will assume. Frank Furedi, who's a Swiss sociologist, has written a lot about this stuff. Wrote a great book called What Has Happened to the University, 2016. Says that in a sense, what used to be called political correctness has now been replaced by emotional correctness. And that we tend to apply the same thinking about the vulnerability of high school students and primary school students to students in higher education. So I think that's going on kind of as well. New politics and linguistic theories that undermine the distinction between speech and its consequences, speech and action are a factor. So that's part of the cultural kind of conflicts that have been going on. So we have this new kind of censorship that occasioned me to write the book, and I've given you some interesting examples about it. Now, I mentioned that there are ebbs and flows of this kind of thing going on in higher education and in the country as a whole. Periods of censorship followed by reaction to censorship. This sort of a yin and yang of liberal democracy. And in the early first decade of the 2000s, there was kind of a period of retreat, an interregnum, if you will. And this happened after many courts invalidated the speech codes or political movements on campus, the first one of which was right here. I was involved with that at Madison. So speech codes got a bad name. They were called speech codes. So in terms of the politics of language, it was easy to associate speech codes with censorship, which still had a bad name. And so you had a period where there was relative freedom on campus, relative. Things were not perfect, but they were better than they have become now. And I commented this to a colleague, a very liberal colleague at Madison. And he said, well, you got to be careful. Political correctness has not died. It's probably just metastasized. A great line, and I think that events have proved him basically right because of the rise of all these new kinds of policies. And the new policies I mentioned, bias reporting, trigger warnings, microaggression, safe spaces, are intended partly to be end runs around censorship because they don't constitute in themselves overt censorship. They're really meant to kind of inform and to protect rather than punish. But they do create a kind of chilling effect. And I've mentioned some examples. Probably the most problematic policies are the bias reporting ones, not because we don't need to know about bias on campus, which we do, but because bias is defined so broadly now, and also because it can be applied in a way which can be very repressive. I'll give you a couple examples from Portland, the infamous Portland. Portland State University's bias reporting program, I'm just reading it here, for example, encourages reporting not only properly sanctionable harassment and threats, which are properly sanctioned, but also physical, spoken, or written acts of abuse, insensitivity, and lack of awareness. So you can be reported in an Orwellian fashion behind your back to the bureaucratic authorities. And at Wisconsin, and once you're reported, that's a state record that cannot be done away with. It has to remain in place for posterity to read if they want. For lack of awareness, insensitivity, those terms are utterly vague. And being insensitive is to some extent part of learning, the right kind of insensitivity anyway. Across town, the University of Portland urged students to report incidents of discomfort, not only to campus administrators, but to the police. So I guess in Portland, police can't do certain things anymore, but they can do this. Really quite interesting and disconcerting. Because, as I point out in the book, and Greg Lukianoff, the head of FIRE, great guy, and Jonathan Haidt at New York University wrote the book in a famous article in which the coddling of America, in which they talk about how important it is to discomfort students in the right way when it comes to learning, because a lot of information, a lot of truths are difficult to deal with. Learning is hard, you got to apply yourself, and a lot of truths are difficult. One thinks of evolution and the massive cultural reaction to evolution. A lot of people, millions of Americans were profoundly insulted and offended by evolution. And I used to tell my students that the monkeys didn't like it either. They didn't want to be associated with human beings. They were offended too. So being offended is part of learning. And the proper task of regulation is to distinguish what kinds of offenses are improper in education and which kinds of ones should be encouraged. But we're not making those kinds of important distinctions, okay? So one objective of my book is to portray the new ways in which campus activists and administrative leaders are engaging in censorship through new means. And in doing so, I joined a number of other books that are cited in my particular work. The book also has 3 other purposes based on my research and experience. First is to be as empirically accurate as possible. That's the empirical component. Higher education, I'm just talking about America now, is a vast domain. What do we have? 4,000, somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 institutions, right? When you count junior colleges, et cetera. It's a vast domain. And so obviously a lot of good things are going on, some of which are in my book. I really try to stress the positive side of this as well as the negative side. And I will give you some examples and talk about them. So getting the empirical question right is really important because truth is important, right? We don't want to exaggerate something that is not true because, as I will point out, truth is the essence of what the university is there to define. And also for strategic reasons, because I don't think we can win this battle over free speech and academic freedom unless we know exactly what's going on and why and how to deal with it. So the empirical part is important. So in this spirit, I depict the status of free speech and academic freedom on campus, not as doomed, but as embattled. And I do this for two reasons. One, I want to be empirically as accurate as possible. And it's difficult to do so. You know, someone's working to know what's going on in higher education. It's like to try to know the streets of Paris. Well, what are the streets of Paris? What is higher education? But also because I want to encourage, the book is sort of a, well, not sort of, it actually is a call to people that care, especially students, administrators, and faculty, to do something constructive about this, to restore the freedom that is so essential to a good education and to the prospects of our liberal democracy. I fear, however, that since the book was submitted in late 2019, came out late last February, and since that time, things have probably gotten worse, even though it's hard to tell with COVID and campus closeouts. But a lot of people have told me that they consider the book too optimistic, even though they valued the critiques as well. And I'm open to that criticism in the book, and maybe if you read it, I encourage you all to read it. Buy a lot of copies, send them to your friends. You know, it's not too late to do Christmas presents. But make your own assessment of that. And if you think I'm too optimistic, fine. I might agree with you now. The point is, whether I'm too optimistic or not, work needs to be done. Give you an example, Princeton. After the events of last summer, and, you know, we all are concerned, reasonable people are concerned about misuse of police power. And we do know that we have long ways to go to achieve more racial justice in America and equality. Question is how we get there. That is the big question, especially in a liberal democracy. It's not just the ends, it's the means that also count. And if we do have new racial issues to deal with, as I stress in the book, that's a situation that calls for more speech, more understanding, more critical engagement back and forth than less. And yet what we seem to be doing is the opposite of that. It's to have less. And I think of Princeton, which I'm sure many of you have read about. After some of the events of the summer, Princeton faculty came up with a manifesto where they said the cause of racial justice requires that we monitor whatever faculty members say, what they teach, and what they research in order to make sure it conforms to what we consider the proper ends and means of racial justice. Well, my view, and I say it in the book often, not just about race, but many other things, how can you have social justice with this kind of oppression of intellectual freedom going on? To me, that's a contradiction in terms. And this is at Princeton, which is one of the leading research institutions in the world. You know, read the Shanghai reports on the status of higher education institutions in terms of research prowess. Princeton's right up there near the top. And they're doing this. And now there was some backlash, but something is still in place there at Princeton that is very problematic and troubling. Okay. And then, of course, I mentioned in the book, Laura Kipnis from Northwestern University, who was subjected to an onerous Title IX investigation about involving gender discrimination. She's a leading liberal feminist and writer, for simply writing an op-ed about rape culture in the Chronicle of Higher Education. Sensitive students considered that unsafe and disagreed with her. So they pursued a Title IX investigation, and the university took it seriously. And that sort of was like everything I mentioned before, but speech, action, distinction being blurred, the very best. Writing an op-ed in a national publication of high repute was charged with being a form of harassment. Now, one cannot think of a better example of the conflation of speech and action. And but unlike many people, Kipnis, who's a woman of great spirit, she actually spoke at my retirement conference here in Madison 4 years ago. Wrote a book about it. It went public. Also wrote in the Chronicle. And what she discovered, she became a lightning rod for people who had been harmed by these kinds of investigations nationwide. No reasonable person opposes policies against harassment. I have witnessed it and I condemn it. But when harassment policies are used in this manner, they lose all mooring, they lose their meaning, and they become oppressive. So here's what she said. People from all over the country started writing her. And she said in her book, and I quote it, in a pivotal moment of my empirical work in the book, I was introduced to an astonishing netherworld of accused professors and students, rigged investigations, closed door hearings, and Title IX officers run amok. This was a world I'd previously known nothing about. No one on campus knows anything about it. And those in the know are terrified to speak out. Now, I can say my experience in Wisconsin has been relatively very principled about dealing with these questions. But even at Wisconsin, we found over the 20-year period, there were some cases of real abuse under the radar screen that we dealt with in my academic freedom group called the Committee for Academic Freedom and Rights that was founded in 1996. So we know from personal experiences that there are these cases under the radar screen, and Kipnis found them and others have found them. They are there. The big question empirically is how many are there? How extensive are they? If they're known on campus, people are afraid to speak out. I can give you examples of people telling me after a certain persecution on campus, people were afraid to say things in class. It spreads. So I also in a separate chapter look at several recent studies on campus attitudes and surveys involving campus opinion on free speech in general and in controversial situations. I'll be very brief, but what I found in many cases, a clear majority of campus citizens do believe in free speech, especially in the abstract, but that's always been the case. But even in more controversial situations, so that does drop when it comes to hate speech, which unfortunately is often very broadly defined so as to be problematic. Certain kinds of hate speech are justifiably seen as harassment, threats, and the like, which are not protected by First Amendment, and properly so. But hates can also be just disagreeing with a policy one person considers important to social justice, a policy disagreement. And anyway, so there is a potential that there are many silent majorities on campuses, but as Kipnis pointed out, they're afraid to speak out. And so and we found this at Wisconsin. We were the first university in the country to abolish a speech code by a political movement on campus. I was very involved in it, and without being ordered to by a court. That was 1999, and generated national press. It was very like a big deal. And we found as that movement moved through the faculty senate for a vote, all these people that we never heard from, that were assumed to have been in favor of the codes, came out on our side because of the arguments we made and events that happened on campus during that year. So there was a silent majority at Wisconsin. And Wisconsin was one of the pioneers in the speech code movement back in the early 1990s. So we took advantage of that. Okay. My second objective, beyond the empirical one, was to present strategic advice for people, for the silent majority to the extent it exists, in order to bring about constructive change on campus. In my concluding chapter, I give some examples and talk about, I present what I call a blueprint for mobilization on campus, and it's based on our group at Wisconsin. We won dozens of policy successes over the years. We defended over 20 people. Some were on other campuses in Wisconsin, but most were here. So we had extensive experience. We worked very closely with fire and other organizations. And I build on that. I talk about KFAR, Committee for Academic Freedom and Rights, horrible acronym. We were acronymically disadvantaged, I think, but we did our best. But we were, very astute politically and in terms of legal representation. And at one point, we even would work with the administration on certain issues because we had gained that kind of respect. But I give an example of a former student of mine at Washington State University, who spoke up when they were talking about adopting a very broad speech code at a public event. And the university legal counsel was impressed and brought Mitch in. And they worked out, the bad speech code was not adopted just because he spoke up and was able to get someone empowered at the university to agree. At State University of New York in Pulse, in New York, there's a free speech movement led by both liberal and conservative faculty members who bring in speakers. I went in there, for example, and have created a climate on campus to give public presence to free speech and academic freedom values, and stress the need for academic diversity of ideas. And they're well entrenched, and some of them are major researchers that have respect on campus. They stood up. There are still issues there, but they have made a difference. Okay, they have helped reset the battle. At Clemson University, a group of faculty members and students issued a public call for a very expansive speech code. 3 professors took out an ad in the student paper challenging it. Because of that one act, Clemson did not adopt that measure. And of course, my group at Wisconsin, the Committee for Academic Freedom and Rights, all sorts of issues. Read the book. I wrote a book back in 2005 also that Jenna mentioned, where I talk about KFAR as well. So I won't get any more details on that, but we did a lot of campus work, a lot of campus connections. It was part of our career. Okay, moving toward the conclusion here. In my concluding chapter, and throughout the book, I stress 4 strategic steps in terms of what is to be done. And as I write in the introduction, I'm quoting, upholding higher education's responsibility to nourish and defend intellectual freedom requires 4 essential tasks or obligations. Knowledge, 1, of the principles and requisites of intellectual freedom. A knowledge that includes grasping the proper limits of freedom. The book does talk about the limits of free speech and why it's important to know those. 2, commitment to those principles and basics. 3, the will to act in their defense in the face of the pressures that arise in an imperfect world. I'm just quoting myself here. And finally, giving priority to these obligations, which is of central importance to higher education because that task is the pursuit of truth. The theme of proper prioritization is essential to the book. Universities are full of a lot of activities. I list them in the book. All sorts of, diversity, athletics, student internships, a lot of programs, overseas study, international programs, you name it. It's a vast forest. It's easy to lose sight of why we are there that make us a distinctive institution. And you can get lost. the forest can be lost among the trees, is a metaphor that I use, not very original, but there it is. And so the issue though is what happens when the rubber hits the road. When an angry group of students says such and such a thing that normally, that under any other thinking would be protected speech, needs to be silenced because it upsets us. And they come up with emotional and moral arguments that put pressure on the administration, and the majority is silent about it. Defending free speech only matters when there is pressure against it. And that means having the proper mission of the university as your moral compass, your moral charter, which is to pursue truth through academic freedom and intellectual standards. It's that simple. So that leads me toward the end here. What is the essential mission? The central mission. It's the normative part of the book. And chapter 7, I pull it all together, but it's also in other parts of the book as well. The pursuit of truth through the exercise of intellectual virtues of honesty and commitment to reason and adherence to academic freedom. I picked the university as what I call an intellectual polis. It's a community. It's the way it was for me. Research, teaching, service, interactions with students and others, and events on campus. It's a special community, like a Greek polis, without the polis's discrimination, that is there for the process of thinking and arguing. Speech should be alive, not just in the formal areas, but in the nooks and crannies of the campus. So that's the central purpose of the university. Let me conclude though with a final thing. I have a whole chapter on the distinction between academic freedom and free speech. And I know my time is running out here. I got to be brief on that, but it's a very important distinction. Academic freedom pertains to those professional contexts like classroom, research, and other professional encounters, where we expect people to abide by the relevance of the subject matter at hand and by standards of intellectual inquiry and expertise. We don't want astrologers teaching courses in astronomy, to put the matter simply. So there are intellectual standards that will be expected. And when we make the right decision about tenure, we're looking at the intellectual quality of something. We don't give tenure to quacks. So, but then outside of that context, then free speech general principles, similar to those of the First Amendment. And I would endorse private schools to do that too, but private schools are different because they have their own right to set their own agendas. I have a whole section about that in the book. Maybe you can talk about that in the Q&A. But outside of that, you let your hair down more. We allow a lot more discourse. And I depict the two realms, the professional realm and the non-professional realm of speech, as dialectically nourishing each other, because the professional realm instills rigor and intellectual standards that contribute to the discussion outside of the classroom, whereas the discussions outside of the classroom can challenge and energize what goes on inside the classroom. So I look at the two realms as distinct, but also fundamentally interrelated and helping to nourish each other. So that's that. I'm a horrible concluder when it comes to speech. I usually just stop. And I'm stopping.
Thank you, Dr. Downs. That was great. I'm sure a lot of our viewers are ready to go purchase your book. And we already have 2 questions for you. And so I'll get started. The first is from a viewer named Martha. She says, I'd like to hear Dr. Downs say more about the public-private distinction he mentioned briefly during the presentation. Could he say more about how the collapsing distinction between privacy and the public realm is undermining democracy and what the link to higher education is?
Yeah, that's, I sort of threw that in. It's not in my notes, but it's an important point. So let me do my best on it. Well, I mean, part of it is like, universities, we're making a big point about safe spaces. And to some extent, I mean, we all have safe spaces, right? I have a lazy boy at home I would come home to and retreat into my lazy boy. We all need them in some extent. The civil rights movement needed safe spaces to go to the church, and there they really had to be safe because they were threatened. So we have that. But privacy is the realm of liberty, right? Of individualism. I didn't get into the benefits of speech like I should have. It was in my notes, but I saw I was running out of time. I talk in the book about deontological, which means something that's good in itself, regardless of empirical consequences, that free speech is an inherent human right. So it makes us human, among other things. And to deny free speech to someone is to deny their humanity. The other is pursuit of truth. And that's the more public thing. We get together and argue, and also in our own homes alone. And then the third is the character issue, that exposure to free speech and learning how to make arguments to stand up for yourself in a civil way in the front of intellectual debate develops character and strength, which help sustain us as a country, okay? But part of it, the other side of that is just pure individual liberty. The stuff, Thoreau, Whitman, the right to pursue your own destiny according to your own terms. And a free society the state has to keep its hands off that kind of thing and not get engaged in your thoughts, your private thoughts. We see now in higher education, I was brought into university or college in Tennessee, where the student activists brought me in because the dean there was compelling them to inform on one another based on what they said in private conversations that she considered detrimental to social justice, which was quite Orwellian. And they brought me in because they had tried everything and she wouldn't budge. I'd said, in the end, you're going to have to do some sort of very peaceful civil disobedience. So they didn't really want to go there. There was really no other kind of choice. And I think of, Dr. Zhivago, which is probably a turning point in my life in reading, that is all about the integrity of the private sphere, where one's thoughts can be one's own, and where it's a realm that the state can't touch. A lot of these policies represent, you say something in the dorm to your roommate, and then they go tattle through biased reporting based on something you said that was quote unquote insensitive or discomforting. So the private sphere is there to protect us from the often overweening power of the state or the administration. That is definitely part of a free society. It's that simple. And I think I've already alluded here now to the effect on higher education. And a lot of free speech is, we also have a lot of free speech theory, and jurisprudence is about protecting the privacy of a freedom of association. I now see that there are groups in America now that are creating blacklists for people that voted the wrong way or that would say things that are now considered part of things that we're condemning. Blacklists that follow people. Well, the Supreme Court dealt with blacklists, membership lists in the South during the civil rights movement back in the 60s and late 50s, that local communities would establish membership lists that they then shared with other people so they would then be retaliated against, lose their jobs as teachers, lose their job in the local bank because they were part of the civil rights movement. And the Supreme Court said those membership lists by the state were unconstitutional. Same thing should apply. When a university denies group membership because a group is inconsistent with the university's goals, when the university requires people to tattle on people or encourages people to tattle on people, that does away with that whole sphere of privacy, but as part of not only individual freedom, but of our social freedoms that should be free from the state. So yeah, so you can tell I could write another book just on that. And I do believe though that private schools, they have independent rights. I think it's good we have private schools that don't abide by the normal First Amendment, because that adds to the cultural diversity of our society. But a lot of them claim to protect free speech, but don't. And they have to be clear if whether or not they're going to abide by First Amendment principles or not.
Thank you. The next question is a gentleman named Craig. He says, my background is relevant to my question. One, I've near 20 year, he's a near 20-year trustee at a small historic liberal arts college and a parent of 2 high school age children in major metro public school system. And he asks, with the stranglehold that teachers, schools, and the woke left have on shaping faculties, will folks like you be winnowed out and the few remaining become powerless, de facto kind of zoo animal oddities? Should we instead heed recent admonitions that argue for conservatives establishing and funding their own schools to serve a very underserved market?
Yeah, well, I would hate to have to resort to an ideological kind of school like that, but um, that would only be if it was absolutely necessary. But you have Liberty University, right? I mean, that is sort of like that, or famous one in Michigan.
Hillsdale.
I apologize to anyone from Hillsdale looking at that. I didn't think of it right away. Sorry, because I have deep respect for it. Hillsdale is like that kind of school, right? And what's great about it is it's not just a retreat into sort of a conservative domain that is its own safe space. It's intellectually rigorous, right? And it reaches out to the world, but on its own terms. So maybe Hillsdale is kind of a great, if you're going to do it, that's the way to go. Is there a winning out of people that are more conservative, or even would be worse, of liberals who abide by and believe in liberal education, liberal principles of freedom? One thing we found, and answer to that, is that's something we need to be concerned about. Especially if the composition of a faculty shifts 1 or 2, positions, and you start getting a critical mass the other way. It is something to be concerned about. One thing that we found, it's part of the, I stress it in the book when I talk about remedies and mobilization, and this might be part of the silent majority. An awful lot of traditional type liberals don't like what's going on, but they're reluctant to speak out because of their colleagues or for other reasons. They'd be accused of being insensitive. And our movement at Wisconsin became as successful as it did because we were able to attract liberals like that. So we had conservatives, libertarians, and liberals, some very liberal, who also believed in civil liberties. And that's the kind of balance you need. But yes, I think there's a definite concern, especially if wokeness becomes even more prominent as an end in itself, then having the right attitude about things becomes more important than the freedom to speak your mind, because disagreement then becomes seen as inimical to the achievement of your ends. Constitutional democracy requires due respect for those who disagree with you rather than shutting them down. So yeah, that's a concern. But I would encourage, if you're going that separate route, do it right. Be a model of what higher education could be. Be like Hillsdale. And Liberty has a lot of good aspects too. I gave a talk there once. I'm not by any means putting Liberty down. They've had recent issues. That's a whole different question. I cannot hear you.
Sorry, I was on mute. Next, I'm going to go to a question that came in via Facebook. He says, what exactly should be done to protect academic freedom? I'm writing a dissertation about restricting freedom of speech at the university. I'm from Georgia, the country. He's from a city, or he or she is from a city that I can't pronounce. Officially, we have adopted the protection of academic speech in the Constitution. Plus, it is incorporated in law of higher education. But all the universities are doing is just writing in the regulatory document that academic freedom should be protected. So it sounds like they're not really doing anything.
That's a great point. There's way too much of that. The Chicago, I didn't mention the University of Chicago principles that were pushed by famous law professor Jeffrey Stone down there. And Wisconsin was the 9th university in the country to adopt those as our governing intellectual principles. Was very much part of that movement, along with, we worked with the Board of Regents on it back in 2015 in December. And that's important in itself, because it represents people coming together to do it. So you created this kind of mobilization in order to do it. But it also can just be lip service if other issues become pressing and it's not sustained. You know, what is it that, you know, famous free speech champions have always argued? Free speech has to be constantly fought for because there's pressures against it all the time. In my book, I say one of the enemies of free speech is human nature, and that has to be challenged, that part of human nature. And it's the same thing with these principles. You know, once you have them out there, then you got to fight every day to keep them going, because there are going to be other issues that come up on campus that are going to press against them. So this is why the issue of prioritization is really the focal point of my book in terms of the kind of strategy that this caller is concerned about. That's what you have to do. And you've got to seek, and you might be able to find, look for allies, look for people that people respect to take your position, make reasonable arguments for your position, build a movement. Or if become a student group, reach out to faculty that are sympathetic. That's what we did here. We were lucky at Wisconsin for the years that this was going on, because we had major faculty members that had national, international reputations that got on board. And so suddenly people didn't just say, oh, you're a bunch of quacks. You know, they had to respect us. And but that's what you have to do. And sometimes it's really hard. It ends up, I know places where it's like the myth of Sisyphus. You know, trying to push that stupid little pebble up the hill, and it keeps falling down because they don't have the resources there to get the ball rolling, to develop a bandwagon kind of effect. But that's sort of what it takes. And make an effort, you know, better to fail nobly than not to try.
So you talking about Sisyphus actually is a great segue to our next question from Matt. The problem with playing permanent defense is that it is bound to eventually fail. No matter how many free speech cases we successfully defend, university administrators will continue the abuses so long as they face no consequences.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think of any cases where any administrators actually lost something after one of their PC attacks was deflected? You know, aside from mild embarrassment, he says they cannot be embarrassed.
Yeah, there's something to that. You know, a guy named Sam Abrams up at Sarah Lawrence, and Sam's a very good political scientist. He's also written about this stuff, and he was persecuted for over a year. It was a horrible case. I use Sam in my book. For some reason, his persecution didn't end up getting in there, and I regret that to this day, because it was a great example. But I did talk about it, and he did a study of administrators. He didn't deal with administrators' views on speech. So maybe he has since I wrote the book, but they were 100%, almost 100% in sync in terms of political ideology, which is another issue. You know, if you had more political diversity on campus, a lot of these problems wouldn't exist, because you'd have more equal power on different sides of the political divide. And so if the game of censorship is partly about politics, then you'd have resistance. You'd have more resistance than you do. So part of the problem is the imbalance of political ideology on campus, which has gotten much more significant over the last several decades. It's very well documented, at least in many, many schools. Other schools less so, but very many schools. So yeah, there's something to that. Administrators, you know, you can't fire them except for cause, probably. They have their own agendas. The only thing that can work is getting the right people, you know, and maybe members in the press. And I talk about this in the book a fair amount. I don't like state legislatures getting too much involved in this, because that's bringing the state in, and that's always going to have an unintended consequence, right? But reaching out, our speech movement at Wisconsin that led to the abolition of the faculty speech code, we got the press on our side. Expanded, you know, it's a classic sort of James Madison remedy that he talks about in Federalist Number 10. If you expand the scope of the conflict, you bring in more support, more factions, so a dominant faction no longer can prevail as easily. That's a whole scheme of Federalist Number 10. Many factions create less possibility of tyranny. So free speech movements need to develop not only allies on campus, but outside, FIRE, okay, other academic freedom groups, get them involved, and then try to persuade people, as many people on campus, that's in the end, that's where it's really at. But yeah, it's a difficult thing. And it's at some places there's going to be defeat, right? And like I said before, it's better to lose nobly than not to lose. Or no, better to lose nobly than not nobly. I'm not sure that's the greatest answer, but it's a problem. It's definitely a problem. The overweening power of bureaucracy. It's also a problem at the national level, isn't it? Because there's less accountability. And I think, I'm in favor of making the administrative state more amenable to democratic norms of accountability at the national level as well as in higher education.
Thank you. The next question comes from David. He says, do you think that critical race theory is a danger to academic freedom and intellectual diversity?
It can be if it's, it's sort of the ironies of academic freedom go all the way back to classic free speech case. Should we give free speech rights to communists who, once they took over, would deny free speech for others, who believe in elections until they win the election? Sort of the same question with critical race theory. Critical race theory exacerbates the issues of identity, which I think can be disempowering if taken too far. Martin Luther King, I'm proud to be Black. I'm also proud to be an American, and I want America to live up to its standards. King was both racially proud and a universalist in his understanding of rights. That's what we need, is that kind of balance. The universalism has to be there because that's what we are, makes us we the people, rather than we the divided people. And critical race theory, I think, exacerbates the division, and it leads to a culture of complaint and disempowerment of people rather than empowerment, ironically, because it overemphasizes the victimhood of people, even though victimization exists. I'm not denying that. But once you define yourself that way, it's harder for constructive things to come out of that. So it's a question, but then again, can you censor it on campus? Of course not. That would be a contradiction in terms. So here's the classic case where you protect its right to speak, but then you push counter arguments. And you're damn careful to protect the rights of those who disagree with it. Even if they're called, you're racist because you're against critical race theory. Critical race theory's got a lot of problems attached to it. It needs to be challenged. So, citizenship's a responsibility. If you don't like something that's being said, you need to counter it with examples, and you need to organize. It is about power. You need to back the right ideas with the power of the word, as well as with the power of people. And, the framers understood that. They knew that the Constitution's not self-executing, because that's the original, the person who called in before. You passed the Chicago principles, great. The battle's not over. That's just one tool in the battle. So yeah, critical race theory definitely needs to be countered. At the same time that it's, you allow it among those who, I've taught it in First Amendment because it was out there as an argument. And, but then if I taught it dogmatically, but it's not good to teach anything dogmatically.
Thank you. I've got a question, another question from Martha. She says, my colleagues, including some in the AAUP, now talk as if our values of inclusion and diversity demand that we drop or revise the commitment to academic freedom. I have yet to hear any example of how my exercise of my academic freedom fails to include someone or fails to recognize that we are very diverse. Mm-hmm. How did this argument that academic freedom is at odds with inclusivity gain traction?
Yeah, I think I alluded to that in the talk. that speech deemed detrimental to the ends of social justice, as certain people define it, was seen as pernicious because the end justified the means. We got to rush to this end. If you're criticizing a particular policy that we think is absolutely imperative to achieve what we think is justice, we need to shut you up. The danger with that is that you are then engaging in censorship and denying people rights. What kind of justice comes out of that? So that's sort of the origin of it. And you think about like what happened with due process on campus. That, you know, everyone is against, every reasonable person, of course, is against harassment, against sexual assault, right? And I'll tell you, this is part of the university's self-interest as institutions. They downplayed sexual assault on campus, wouldn't even produce records of it for decades. That's one thing that the Title IX movement has done, is make them more aware of that, okay? But then when someone's charged, you can't do away with basic norms of due process in dealing with it just because the end is so important. Because then where does it stop, right? Even guilty people are entitled to due process, a fundamental principle of our Constitution. And if you say that due process doesn't matter because some things are more important than others, you are undermining the constitutional, the status of the Constitution that is there to protect everybody. And I, you know, going back to AAUP, boy, they haven't always had their act together. They did not oppose the original speech codes. One of their members wrote an article 10 years ago about why FIRE had replaced the AAUP as the leading defender of individual rights in education. And then the AAUP started getting its act together more. But so you're going to redefine academic freedom so you can't have certain thoughts, right? That is not academic freedom. You know, Orwell, you know, what is Orwell would say? I forgot that Jonathan Rauch talks about it in Kindly Inquisitors. That Orwell speak is to say that something anti-freedom is freedom. And this sort of seems to me that we're going to redefine academic freedom in a way that would shut up contrary voices. That is not academic freedom. If you include due respect for students as part of academic freedom in the class, that's fine, as long as it's done right. I mean, we all do that. Gratuitous offense. We had a case in Wisconsin back in 1988 where a grad student every week when the section in a class was held, a woman walked in, young woman with a Catholic cross, and he would make fun of her for being a Catholic. Nothing to do with the subject matter of the course, utterly gratuitous. She was really offended. She came and spoke, he wouldn't shut up. She came to the chair. He set up a little committee. I was on that committee. And I said, you know, this isn't academic freedom. Now, if they're talking about religion and politics, and everyone's giving their honest view, and he makes an argument about Catholicism in politics that she doesn't like, that's different, because now you're talking about a matter that's germane and relevant to the course, not gratuitous, invidious offense. That's where you draw the line. Now, that kind of speech in public, that's free speech. But in a classroom, it's not. And that's where academic freedom is different from free speech. Supreme Court once said about free speech, there's no such thing as a false idea. Well, you don't want universities based on that principle. And certainly in a classroom, you know, 2 and 2 is not 5. 2 and 2 is 5 in Dostoevsky's Underground Man, and it's a great novel, but it's not so in a mathematics class. So there is a difference between academic freedom and free speech. But academic freedom also has to be protective of all ideas, however, I would say, even offensive, as long as they are honestly held ideas that are germane to the subject matter of the class. And if you deviate from that, then it's not academic freedom, it's something else. It's political imposition of an ideology.
Thank you. I believe that was our last question. I do want to remind all of our participants of the name of your book, which is Free Speech and Liberal Education: A Plea for Intellectual Diversity and Tolerance. You can find it on Amazon, and you can find in the chat box, I put a link to the review that George Leaf did of the book, which also includes a link to where you can buy it on Amazon. And I encourage everyone to go out and get a copy if you were interested in the talk today. Thank you again, Dr. Downs, for being with us. Thank you to all our participants, especially those who asked questions. And thank you to those of us who have given support, those of you who had given support to the Martin Center so we can host more events like this. I hope all of you have a great afternoon. Thanks.